just leave. This is mine. Well, good afternoon, everyone. The Rules Committee will come to order, and today we will consider 4 measures which seek to support the health and well-being of our constituents. First, H.R. 7666, the Restoring Hope for Mental Health and Well-Being Act of 2022. As many of us have noted over the past few years, we have a mental health and substance abuse crisis in the United States, and too many of those struggling lack access to adequate help. H.R. 7666 reauthorizes key Health Resources and Services Administration and Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration programs to help address the national mental health and substance use disorder crisis. It will help adults and children with serious mental health conditions that limit basic daily activities like going to school or work. It will also help invest in prevention, treatment, and recovery services to support the nearly 20 million Americans who suffer from substance use disorders. And finally, it will increase access to programs like telehealth care and community-based youth and young adult suicide prevention initiatives. Second, we will consider H.R. 5585, the Advanced Research Project Agency Health Act. Biomedical research will deliver the cures of the future. But biomedical research and development is costly, time-consuming, and often requires mass coordination. These barriers create a consequential gap in our biomedical research ecosystem, one that unfortunately allows some of the best ideas to fall through the cracks despite their promising potential. Establishing an Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health, also known as ARPA-H, will revolutionize how we prevent, treat, and remedy diseases, and help to drive high-risk, high-reward innovations that will drive biomedical breakthroughs for decades to come. These innovations could save the lives and livelihoods of millions of Americans and reduce the cost of care. Third, we will consider H.R. 4176, the Lgbtqi plus Data Inclusion Act. Day in and day out, government agencies and even the United States Congress use federally collected data to make informed policies. When that data is not accurate, it can lead to bad policy choices. One current shortfall in our data collection is that it fails to comprehensively recognize and include Americans who are LGBTQI+. They are effectively invisible in the data that we use to inform the work of government. And as a result, we simply don't have a complete picture to assess, analyze, and address issues that affect those in the LGBTQI+ community. H.R. 4176 will require federal agencies that use surveys to collect voluntary, self-disclosed information on sexual orientation and gender identity. Studies have shown that collecting information on these issues improves the quality of medical care and can inform best practices for LGBTQI+ individuals. Informed policy making begins with inclusive data, and inclusive data begins by making sure that marginalized communities are not invisible, and that we understand, acknowledge, and respect and address their unique needs. Finally, we will consider the Senate amendment to H.R. 3967, the Honoring Our Pact Act of 2022, already passed by the House once before. This legislation opens up VA healthcare access to 3.5 million post-9/11 combat veterans potentially exposed to deadly toxins, while granting presumptions of exposure to veterans with rare cancers and other debilitating diseases. Together, these measures will help advance our country by lightening the burden on those in need of health care, coordinating the efforts of our best scientists and researchers to speed the progress of medical innovation and discovery, and improving quality and fairness of the data collected by our government. I encourage all of my colleagues to support the passage of these bills. And with that, I will turn it over to Ranking Member Cole to provide any remarks that he would care to offer.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Today's hearing covers 4 items. Thankfully, the first 2 items I'll discuss are largely bipartisan, and both arise out of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. H.R. 7666, the Restoring Hope for Mental Health and Well-Being Act of 2022, is a package of mental health bills, and H.R. 5585, the Advanced Research Project Agency Health Act, would authorize the new federal healthcare research agency, commonly known as ARPA-H. Both of these bills were subject of bipartisan negotiations in the Energy and Commerce Committee, and I'm pleased that Chairman Pallone and Ranking Member McMorris-Rodgers were able to come to an agreement. As we all know only too well, COVID-19 pandemic and subsequent lockdowns took an existing national mental health crisis and made it exponentially worse. I'm very pleased the House is taking action to address this mental health crisis and believe the bills included in H.R. 7666 will make important strides toward that goal by reauthorizing and updating existing programs to meet current needs and to limit duplication. Similarly, the COVID-19 pandemic has also demonstrated the need for an agency to take on high-risk, high-reward projects that could lead to future breakthroughs in health research. I'm especially pleased that the resulting bill is fiscally responsible and will ensure proper oversight of ARPA-H as it implements this new research arm. The third bill I'll discuss is also largely bipartisan. We're considering the Senate amendment to H.R. 3976, the Honoring Our Pact Act. This measure will be familiar to the committee as the House initially passed the bill in March. It is back before us today with amendments passed in the Senate. I'm encouraged that the House is moving forward on helping toxic exposed veterans get the assistance they need. It's been a long road getting to this point, but today's legislation is proof that Democrats and Republicans in the House and the Senate can accomplish our shared goals when we set partisan politics aside. While today's bill is not perfect, I believe it's the right thing to do in order to ensure that our nation's toxic exposed veterans get all the care that they are entitled to. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses from the Veterans Affairs Committee about this important piece of legislation. Finally, the last bill for today's hearing is unfortunately a partisan one. H.R. 4176 requires any federal agency that conducts surveys of the American people to ask for deeply private information about sexual orientation and gender identity using questionable methods and with concerning implications for the privacy of minors. Though it is not explicitly stated in the bill, this measure aims squarely at forcing the Census Bureau to ask about these topics during the decennial census and the annual American Community Survey. Under current law, if the Census Bureau identifies a federal data need, it already has the authority to add questions to these surveys. Given how poorly the federal government has done in the past at protecting the private information of American citizens, I'm frankly astonished that the majority thinks having the government to ask Americans for even more private information, presumably to be stored in a hackable database, is a good idea, particularly when the legislation fails to ensure that the data being collected will even be accurate. I'm also astonished that the majority thinks now is a good time to use valuable floor time to push yet another divisive, woke messaging bill. The American people are currently facing an awful economic crisis. Inflation is at historic levels, leading to skyrocketing gas prices and increasing prices for food and other essential goods. This is stretching the paychecks of working Americans to the breaking point. Indeed, we are even hearing stories of people forced to leave jobs because they can no longer afford to buy gas to go to work. This crisis is impacting every single American, but it's especially hurting hardworking Americans who live from paycheck to paycheck. And the crisis is directly attributable to the policies embraced by the Biden administration and the present House majority, beginning with President Biden's overwhelming war on fossil fuels and continuing with the out-of-control spending that the majority has done on a partisan basis. Madam Chair, given the painful extent of this inflationary crisis, Americans would be much better served by the House turning its attention there. But instead, the majority is pushing yet another progressive messaging bill, with no defined purpose or use, and which will not solve the most important issues facing Americans. This is hardly the best use of our time. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
The ranking member, Mr. Cole, yields back. Thank you for your comments. I'd like to welcome our witnesses to provide testimony on H.R. 5585, the Advanced Research Projects Agency Health Act, and H.R. 7666, the Restoring Hope for Mental Health and Wellbeing Act of 2022. Chairman Pallone, Subcommittee Chairwoman Issue, and Subcommittee Chairman Guthrie, we are delighted that you are here with us today. And I now recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Chairman Pallone.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ranking Member Cole and members of the committee. Our plan is for me to talk about the Restoring Hope Act, the mental health bill, and to have Ms. Eshoo talk about ARPA-H, which is the bill that she sponsored. And as you said, she chairs the Health Subcommittee. So I'm going to ask that unanimous consent to my full statement be submitted to the record, but I'm going to try to summarize if I could.
Without objection.
Thank you. So the Restoring Hope Act, as Mr. Cole said, is truly bipartisan. I mean, it came out of our committee unanimously. And it's needed more than ever today. I don't think I have to tell any of you that, particularly during the COVID crisis, mental health concerns, use of opiates, all these things skyrocketed. And, my statement goes into the, gives you more statistics about that. But basically, this bill provides the support and resources needed to meet this crisis in both mental and behavioral health head on. And as was mentioned, we negotiated this for months. Myself, the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Rogers, as well as the two subcommittee leaders that are here today. And it incorporates both Democrat and Republican-led provisions. It's essentially a package of bills from both Democrat and Republican members to seek to battle mental health and substance use disorders. It basically reauthorizes but makes major investments. I don't want to say we're just reauthorizing. I mean, we do a lot to change 30 public health programs. When I say change, I mean, make them more up to date and provide more investments for both SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and HRSA, the Health Resources and Service Administration. And there's a particular emphasis on children and young people, for which this crisis during COVID was even more severe, if you will. And, it's disorder prevention, it's treatment, it's recovery support services. And the main thing also, it continues investments in the block grants that go to states, but it also extends a lot in terms of mental health screening and treatment grants, and there's a lot of emphasis also on American Indians and Alaska Native communities because the problem was very severe there as well. In terms of the opioid use disorders, I just wanted to highlight two things, and I know this was a little sensitive for Mr. Burgess. I probably shouldn't raise it because he may feel that he has to speak on it. Basically what it does is to apply or provide a federal program, if you will, for providers, training for providers, be they doctors, nurses, whatever. But it tries to incorporate that training that's already done at the state level. So if you did the training at the state level, that counts towards now the federal requirement. And then it also, the other thing I wanted to mention before I get to the manager's amendment is that with regard to BUP, I use that term because it's easier for me to pronounce, we had restrictions on how many cases physicians or healthcare providers would be able to entertain. There was a cap on how many people you could treat with BUP, okay? And this eliminates the cap. And that's very significant as well because we felt that during COVID that cap was very unnecessary and led to a lot of people not getting treated. Now let me talk a little bit about the manager's amendment. As Mr. Cole mentioned, it basically pays for the program. So this is totally paid for. There's about $1 billion in spending, and actually the pay-fors I think are even significantly more than that. But I just wanted to mention that. And one of the things that it does, which I know a lot of you, some of you in the past have expressed concern about the PBMs, and one of the ways that we pay for this is to have reporting requirements for their fees. The theory, it doesn't mandate anything, but if there's transparency and they have to report their fees, then the fees tend to be less, and that's how you save money. The manager's amendment also incorporates a bill, HR 7233, keeping incarcerated discharges streamlined for children. A lot of times for kids that are in the juvenile justice system or awaiting trial, they're not covered by Medicaid. And so we want to make sure that that doesn't happen, okay? And the last thing is the manager's amendment includes language from another bill, the Children's and Media Research Advancement. Oh, this is actually Jamie Raskin's bill. I don't know if he's on the virtual, but it requires the National Institutes of Health to examine the effects of modern technology and multimedia on infant, children, and adolescents. So that was added in the manager's amendment. So that's it. I don't want to prolong this because it is bipartisan and it was actually unanimous out of the committee. I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman Pallone. I now recognize the gentlewoman from California, Subcommittee Chairwoman Issues.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. It's good to see you. Ranking Member Cole, to each of the members of the committee, both here present and virtually. I see my friend, Mr. DeSaulnier, there. Are you in California? Can't hear. I don't know if he can hear me. At any rate, it's good to be here. I don't come up to the Rules Committee very often, so it's special for me to be here with you today. In 1944, during the war, President Roosevelt wrote to his chief science advisor, and this is what he wrote to him. New frontiers of the mind are before us, and if they're pioneered with the same vision, boldness, and drive with which we have waged this war, we can create a fuller and more fruitful employment and a fuller and more fruitful life. Now, that's nearly 80 years ago, and 80 years down the road, we have new frontiers of the mind. They're before us once again, and thanks to basic research into the human genome, mRNA, and the biology of the human body, we're close to medical breakthroughs that will help Americans live that fuller life and more fruitful life that FDR wrote about many decades ago. But too many medical breakthroughs die in the valley between basic research and commercialization. Ideas are unpursued because of the perceived risk or the lack of economic benefit. And when innovations are pursued, the process is too slow. Among the 24 most impactful drugs on the market today, the median time between the key discovery and the FDA approval is 32 years. To achieve breakthroughs, we need what FDR wrote to his science advisor, vision, boldness, and drive. And that's what the Bipartisan Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health, ARPA-H, we believe will deliver. Today, there are diseases that when anyone is diagnosed with them, it's a death sentence. And I believe that we can and we must change this. So first, the vision. ARPA-H provides the new agency with a uniquely targeted mission to develop new breakthrough health technologies that are not being met by existing federal programs or private entities. Second, the boldness. ARPA-H gives the new agency the autonomy and independence to pursue a culture of what I think of as radical innovation, disciplined execution, and ambitious accountability. And thirdly, the drive. ARPA-H, the ARPA-H Act, ensures that the new agency will embody the nimble spirit of the esteemed DARPA to pursue large-scale, high-risk projects. I think every member is really well-versed because it's such an extraordinary success what DARPA has brought forward. And it's a completely different setup than really any other federal agency that we have. It empowers program managers to scope and scale milestone-driven projects. So passing ARPA-H, the ARPA-H Act, will provide this new agency, again, the vision, the boldness, and the drive it needs to be successful. And I think that's why the Energy and Commerce Committee voted 53-3 on this. And we have several stakeholders in this room that were there voting for it. And it's supported by top biomedical scientists and researchers, including bipartisan former officials from the NIH, from CDC, and from the FDA. So for all of these reasons, I'm proud to come before you and ask for your support. I believe that this can be transformational. And I'm always mindful that what we do here in the United States of America, our successes become the hope of the world. So thank you for having me as your guest here today. It's an honor to be with you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Chairwoman Issue. I now recognize the gentleman from Kentucky, Subcommittee Ranking Member, Mr. Guthrie. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I'm going to speak on both the bills. And first, I'll start with ARPA-H. ARPA-H, HR 5585, is an important priority for researchers, industry, and most importantly, patients who are waiting for a life-changing medical technology to improve and save their lives, maybe even save their lives. This legislation would authorize ARPA-H within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. This agency would specifically be charged with helping to foster high-risk, high-reward treatments and cures for diseases with clinically unmet needs. Some of my colleagues, and you put me in this category, and when this was first introduced, asked myself the question, all of us the question, why have a new agency? We all know what we want it to do, and we know what happens at its inception, but how do you prevent mission creep and things that happen with agencies moving forward? Well, we addressed these concerns, and we did it in a bipartisan way, sitting around working through this together. We addressed these concerns by clearly defining the number of offices required, that a majority of the offices within the organization must be exclusively devoted to biomedical research and development. We also separate ARPA-H from NIH, limit the amount the agency can spend on administrative costs, require the agency to provide Congress a strategic plan while transparently reporting on projects. And most importantly, to many of my colleagues, this is important to many of my colleagues, this bill explicitly prohibits funding from going to malign nations like China or Russia. Overall, because of these strong guardrails and safeguards, we negotiated ARPA-H past the committee, ENC committee 53-3. And the need for this authorization, I know I have one of my dear friends here in Congress who's also a appropriator. The money was appropriated in the last appropriations bill, $1 billion moving forward. So Congress needs to have its guardrails and its authorization around this moving forward. So funding decisions made by ARPA-H must ensure that precious taxpayer dollars are being spent as appropriately and as effectively as possible, and we must do the proper oversight to make sure the mission is what we expect it to be. And now on to the mental health bill, which was important and worked on very closely and carefully with us and particularly our staffs, getting to the point that we are today, and proud to be where we are. HR 766, the Restoring Hope for Mental Health and Wellbeing Act, is a significant bill that will help support our mental health care workforce, increase access to pediatric mental health treatment, and bolster substance use disorder prevention, treatment, and recovery resources. It sends urgent help to communities, including by continuing to make sure faith-based organizations can compete on equal footing for resources. A recent CDC survey data underscore the stark harm school closures and lockdown measures have had on our youth throughout the pandemic. This bill, it works to reauthorize the Garrett Lee Smith Suicide Prevention Program, provide funding for Suicide Lifeline, and update the major mental health block grants that states use to support those with serious mental illness. And to help improve the safety and well-being of our children, this bill supports community mental health services for children with serious emotional disturbances and permits the mental health block grants to be used for crisis care services and early intervention activities. In addition to supporting those with mental illness, the legislation helps those with substance use disorders Many of drug overdoses we have seen over the past several years have been caused by synthetic opioids like illicit fentanyl poisoning, where over 70% of Kentuckians who died of overdoses in 2020 died from illicit fentanyl. Through the passage of this bill, we are increasing access to critical treatment and recovery resources from people from all walks of life and at every stage of life, including moms and pregnant women, by supporting care for maternal health and substance use disorders, which are among the leading causes of death for pregnant and postpartum women. The bill also includes the Timely Treatment for Opioid Use Disorder Act, which removes federal requirements of having to live with opioid disorder for more than a year before you're admitted to an in-person treatment. I am finally proud that my bill, the Substance Use Treatment and Recovery Support Services Block Grant of 2022, which I led with Representative Tonko, also working with Representatives McKinley and Wild, is included. This legislation would deliver more coordinated substance use disorder care, as well as explicitly reauthorizing the use of funding for recovery support services, which could include workforce training and peer support services. And this bill is physically responsible. All the mandatory spending in the legislation is offset, and the legislation actually reduces the budget deficit by $200 million. It's not a lot, but it is certainly better than going the other direction. It is a strong bipartisan package that deserves support so we can build stronger communities, families, and a brighter future, especially for school-age children and young adults. I urge support, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Guthrie. Without objection, I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record the statement of administration policy in support of House passage of H.R. 5585 and H.R. 7666. As a former 911 dispatcher for 17 and a half years, I've taken my fair share of suicide calls. From a perspective of someone trying to get help because they really don't want to go through with it and want to be talked out of it, you can be very successful. In other cases, you answer the phone and the only thing that you hear is a gunshot because they want anyone but their family to find their remains. It's a very difficult call to answer. I had so many of those calls that I volunteered for the suicide hotline in Los Angeles at the time. So on the mental health issue, this legislation is so important. I think it will address so many concerns that we have in our communities, in our neighborhoods, from safety concerns to homelessness issues. The homeless population in America has grown in every community across the United States. And it's not always about the lack of resources. Oftentimes, at least in my community, it deals with addiction. And how you deal with somebody with such a severe addiction to a narcotic, I think these two bills will bring resources to our communities to help address those concerns. So thank you for working together and bringing this package of bills before us. I will now turn to Mr. Cole for any questions that he may have.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And before I begin with my questions, I just want to thank all three of you and thank Ranking Member McMorris-Rogers for the work on both these bills. I've been a big supporter of ARPA-H and certainly voted for it in the funding bills, but expressed at the time we had concern because Energy and Commerce had not had an opportunity yet to do exactly what you've done here, which is set up guardrails, give us some idea of how this money would actually flow and what you've done. And I think you've really put together good packages here. So it's just really good work, Mr. Chairman. So well done, and to all of you. Let me start with you, Mr. Guthrie, if I may. The ARPA-H bill before us today has some significant changes from the original version that was introduced and considered by the Energy and Commerce Committee. You described for the committee some of the important improvements that were negotiated as the legislation was moving forward.
I think one of the biggest issues that we worked on together and worked with the White House, quite honestly, that several of us went down to the Oval Office meeting for this, was where does ARPA-H belong? Where does it where does it go? And there was a big discussion of whether it should be within NIH or not. I believe as it originally introduced, it was a agency of NIH, and there was concerns that it would just get swallowed up in that enormous agency. And if the idea was to be like DARPA, that's what the president of DARPA talked about, it needed to be a separate entity. So I think that was one of the big things moving forward. The other thing is just tightening up on the definition of what it's supposed to do. We had a great hearing about what it was supposed to do, and everybody talked about it as we were discussing. When you launch an agency, you got to know it's going to be around for a while. So how do you fine-tune the definition about what it's supposed to do? And I remember asking just earlier, what's a good example of the difference in what NIH does, what ARPA-H does, and what the private sector does? Because that's where you end up. And one of the things is NIH would do research they're doing the BRAIN Initiative, research on the brain. A good example of what we envision ARPA-H to do would be something like, how do you connect the activity in the brain with a biometer so that you can have an arm that moves because your brain's telling it to move, and prove the concept, and then it gets commercialized in the private sector and produced. And so it's the link. And we thought that if it was part of NIH, it would get swallowed up and not be the link between NIH and private sector in some of these areas. We wanted to make sure that funding, there was a big concern, could be spent overseas, and we saw what happened. We were still trying to get to the bottom of everything with Wuhan. I understand that. We're trying to get to the bottom. But it's, there's the National Security Act in 1947, so entities can't be, so essentially this would say that Russia, China, Iran are our biggest adversaries, and North Korea couldn't participate in that. And then any foreign entity would have to have a national, American national, U.S. national collaborator. And then we didn't want to make sure there's a handful of people getting all the grants, so it limits it to 3 at any time to any organization. So those are some of the big changes that we wanted to do.
Well, again, I'm very appreciative that those kind of concerns are reflected, and you might elaborate just a little bit more. I mean, I think you made the right call on keeping the NIH, and again, I say this as a big supporter of the
Yes, you are.
but I think you're exactly right to have them separate because the functions are different. There's clearly going to be a robust relationship between the two, but the separation, I think, was really, really important. Let me just, you touched on this, Representative Guthrie, but could you give us a little more on the specific things you did where adversarial countries are concerned? Because we do have some concerns about those countries having penetrated and manipulated our own research dollars in the past. This is something that I think scientists with the best will in the world don't want to ever imagine that scientific colleagues might be have a nefarious purpose, but sometimes they do. That's just the world we live in. And so, again, I think you built some pretty important guardrails here.
Yeah, the bill prohibits funding going to non-domestic recipients organized under the laws of what are known as the covered foreign countries. So I just kind of touched on that, the 119C. The countries come top of my head are Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. And under the law, so those are covered. And any other cover, I think that the 1947 Act allows the Director of National Intelligence deem who else would be on that list as well. But in addition, the ARPA-H director is required to submit an annual report to Congress on projects supported by the agency and whether these projects are meeting the agency's goals and whether or not any of the project award recipients have participated in foreign talent programs.
And let me ask both you and my good friend, the chair of the subcommittee, you did add a lot more specificity to the structure of ARPA-H, which again was one of the things we were very uncomfortable with on both sides of the aisle. This was not a unique concern to one or the other when we were doing the appropriation function because we were flying a little bit blind, but it was a presidential priority. We needed to get it in there. We wanted the money to be there so that when you got your work done, hopefully things would be ready to move. So what are some of the changes on the structure? I'll start with you, if I may, Madam Chair, on that, particular thing, how you defined it a little more sharply.
Well, I think that, first of all, what was considered vagueness ended up being, addressing all of that, really brought it into its fullest form, its best form. because we had to answer every question. And as you said, members from both sides of the aisle had those questions. And we had a great deal of input from the scientific community as well. Scientists that had worked at NIH on various projects, former FDA commissioners, really from, the many respected stakeholders. I was totally agnostic about where this should be. It really came from the scientists, from the scientific community. And now, it wasn't 100%, but there was an important percentage that spoke about the culture and the mission, and they're different. You're one of the biggest supporters of NIH in the Congress. Each one of us considers ourselves as not ever taking a back seat in our support of NIH. And it was unfortunate that at least in some discussions, that it was viewed as an attack on NIH. It was nothing of that sort. I think that the project managers and the number of projects are very important. When you look at why DARPA is so successful, it's flat, and they don't stay forever. The brilliance keeps rotating. That's built into it. The specificity relative to, the work that they are to do, the funding. I mean, it's really, I have to say that a lot of legislation doesn't contain the specificity that this does. But we are creating a new agency, and I think that we've done a very good job on this. I have to say that. I'm prouder today than I was when I first introduced it.
Ms. Guthrie?
It's interesting when I look at agencies today or regulations today or things today, somebody created those for a reason. And the question you always ask yourself, are they doing what was the original intent of Congress, so moving forward? And one of my frustrations since I've been here was use a lot of vague language, and so therefore gives a lot of authority, whichever side's in the executive branch. And so what we really did here is try to really narrow, so we sort of see a mirror or a playbook, because they're already organizing based on the appropriations, ARPA-H. And the proposal for the administration is there are 14 offices. I think 6 of the 14 are research and development offices. There's an Office of Leg Affairs, so if you're gonna be a standard, I'm gonna start an agency and it's gonna be typical, then I'm gonna have an Office of Leg Affairs, an Office of Public Affairs, an Office, and so forth. And we don't want that. We don't want this to be that. We want this to be focused on research and development. So we limit it to 6 offices, and at least 4 have to be specifically driven by, for research of the 6. Y'all have offices of the director, y'all have that. And then the other one is there's a 15% cap on administrative fee. So the 85% has to go to research. And I think that's a big difference in some of the agencies we've seen.
That's it. Now, I want to make another point here, which, again, I want to congratulate all of you on. Because, again, when we were dealing with it in appropriations, we didn't have the time to do what you're doing and accomplished, I think, here. And, of course, we left a great deal of discretion to the executive branch in the form of my good friend, he is my good friend, our former colleague, Secretary Becerra. And that's just too much to leave to one person, no matter, he's got a pretty big job anyway. And the idea he would be able to sit down and think through this the way that your committee has done, I think it just simply wouldn't have happened. So I think this has been good. Last question on ARPA-H. A lot of groups that support it, obviously, but it's hard to judge how ARPA-H will be, what are the criteria that will decide and make it a successful thing? So, again, how did you define the mission and separate it, again, from NIH and other entities? Yeah, you can go ahead and then, obviously, the chairwoman.
Ms. Eshu. So the mission is defined as, it's got to be biomedical research based, it's to meet unmet needs, and it's to treatments that are try to come up with ways of doing treatment. And it is one of those things that we defined as well as we could, and it's hard to say, we want you to go out and cure cancer and make bionic limbs that work for people and things, but those are where we're going, so we try to use as tight of language as we can to make sure, and then require a lot of reporting to make sure they really are focused on the gap. So the way we defined it in the law is it's the gap between general research, which is what I described, just in research on the brain, and then what a lot of the research that comes from NIH, private industry can take it and run with it. And that's what we want to happen too, because then it gets commercialized, it gets out there, and people have it. But there are some things that need that extra step that is too expensive and the regulatory uncertainty and the uncertainty of success. But wouldn't it be nice to have? And an example that Brett Gerard, who some of us knew, you knew him when you were overseeing HHS, Deputy Secretary, testified, and he said DARPA did stealth technology. They didn't invent the airplane, but they came up with the stealth technology and then gave it to the Air Force to use and commercialize and buy airplanes with. And so that's how do you define that? That was a challenge. And that's what a lot of debates back and forth were. But I think we've got it as tight as we can get it, and still give them flexibility to go out and try to create the next great cure.
Chairman Eshoo?
Yes. Well, I just want to hearken back to something that I said in my testimony. We had excellent testimony on this, and we all paid rapt attention. And it was, what the mission should be, and then how to design it so that the mission becomes a reality. And that is that we do extraordinary basic research in our country, NIH. And we have a robust private sector. But there is a valley in between the two where a lot of good ideas, innovation die. And it's not pox on anyone's house. It's simply the way our world works. The private sector will take risk up to a certain point because they have investors. So they can't take, they're not high-risk operations. They have to answer to the venture capitalists that are investing in them. And the other federal programs are not what we envision this to be. So to create an agency, and DARPA is really the 18-karat gold model. We see what has come out of it, and we had a lot of testimony on the culture, exactly how it works. The Admiral spoke to it because he came out of DARPA. We had former DARPA directives. We asked directors. We asked them many questions. So that's how, we kept learning. We kept learning. Now, what is the dream to come true is going back to what I said. We all know this from our own families, from the family of our constituents. There are diseases today where we don't have an answer to them. I had a constituent with ALS, and she said to me, let me put this to you very simply. I die a little every day. And so this is what we're shaping in order to take that on.
Let me turn to H.R. 7666 now, and I direct these questions both to Mr. Guthrie and obviously Chairman Pallone. This is really the first comprehensive mental health legislation we've had post-COVID. And so I'm very curious as particularly, again, you've looked at a lot of, as we have on the Appropriations Labor H subcommittee, on some of the damage, particularly to younger people that lockdowns and isolation did. Describe to me, how did you guys work together to craft the legislation? What did you prioritize in trying to reauthorize and redirect, refocus some of these programs? Start with you, if I may, Mr. Chairman.
I can't, I don't want to say that we were prioritizing on any particular thing because, it has every aspect. I mean, it's prevention, it's treatment. But basically what we did is we looked at the programs that were available, under SAMHSA and HRSA, and we tried to make sure that those programs for children and young people were prioritized, and that if there was any new way of, or way that they had to be treated differently, that we would, emphasize that and sort of update it. I can't say, one of the biggest concerns is what Mrs. Torres said, is the incidence of suicide. And so that was probably a priority. But other than that, other than saying that the focus was on young people, and within that focus, that a big issue was suicide prevention.
Mr. Guthrie?
I'll agree with my colleague from New Jersey, the chair. We were focused, a lot of it, we were looking at mental health for young children, particularly that were more affected by not being in school, lockdowns, than maybe others were. So the suicide prevention, moving forward, there is a bill that's included in this that Richard Hudson has done on Medicaid that can continue their mental health provisions if they're pre-confinement, if they're, the mental health person, if a juvenile is in the judicial system, they can still maintain their Medicaid coverage for the mental health services. Those are important, of just things that, not just because of COVID, but we spent a lot of time on the committee looking at maternal health. We have a lot of maternal deaths in this country that is disturbing to all of us. In an industrialized world we are. Dr. Burge spent an enormous amount of time in a hearing on that when he was chair of the subcommittee. And so there are programs in Medicaid for that as well. So I don't think it was just a set priority, but these are things we really needed to move forward. And then there were a lot of different stakeholder groups and so forth that would come with new ideas and new authorizations. And so what we decided to do, instead of creating new agencies, to find programs where they fit, and then reauthorize the program with new missions within the program instead of creating new and separate programs. That was an important priority.
One thing that maybe I shouldn't mention, but I'll say, with a lot of these things, and particularly when Mr. Guthrie mentioned maternal health, we did things, I think it's on, yeah. We did a lot in suspension bills and bills that passed the House, but the Senate never took them up, right? And then we tried to put a lot of them in the Build Back Better Act, which of course hasn't passed. We'll see what happens. And so there was an opportunity to include some of those things that had passed on suspension in here as well. And, attack it from different fronts. That's what you do in approps too.
Yeah, if you can't get it one way, you try to get it another. Let me have one last question, and again, I direct this again, since it's 7666, to both Mr. Guthrie and the chairman. As you wrestle with these programs, and there are multiple programs in here, the big problems are always duplication and siloing at the same time. So what are the measures, if any, that as you looked at this legislation, okay, how can we keep those things from happening? How can we make sure that we don't have multiple people basically doing the same thing, and yet at the same time, since you're dealing with mental health, we can have communication, cooperation, back and forth, and work these things together. Did you do anything different in that, or is...
Well, I think it was as I mentioned, you have about 30 different programs in here that are reauthorized. And so I know I'm giving you a very simplistic answer, but basically looked and see the things that didn't work and get rid of them, and then add the things that did, that we thought were new and innovative within those 30 programs, that already exist. And then with the mandatory spending, it was the same thing. And then, of course, as you can imagine, Kathy was very concerned that, that we offset everything. Mr. Guthrie said we actually have, I don't know exactly how it works, but we actually cut more than, in other words, the spending resulted in deficit. He says deficit reduction, but I fully intend to look for other ways to spend that excess money. Yeah,
For the moment, it's deficit.
For the moment, it's deficit reduction.
Mr. Guthrie?
Yeah, that's important. So we did want to streamline the bills and not make sure they're siloed, that they work together. And one example, Representative Tonko and I worked on the substance use disorder block grants, and there was a group that wanted set-asides for recovery, and it's a block grant that's, so if you've seen a lot of block grants around here, they start out as block grants, and then different groups will come to us, and they're important, but instead of being block grant, we start designating where all the blocks are granted. And so we were able to maintain that as a block grant, but we did put specific authorizing language, say it's specifically authorized to do this, although we didn't give a set aside for it. And that was recovery support services. So we wanted to maintain flexibility. And so where the programs work together, we really spent a lot of time, our staffs did, trying to make sure that they worked and moving forward. And then on the pay for, it's PBMs that they have to expose or have to make available to employers, the people who are paying the bills for the drugs, the difference between what they're negotiating from the drug company and what they're charging the employer for. And that proved to be a $2.2 billion savings.
Last 2 points. First, number one, I would just urge you, it's not my business what the Energy and Commerce Committee does, but particularly on ARPA H, I hope you'll hold hearings in the future, because I think it's going to take some oversight and probably some fine tuning as you guys get into that, because I think we're going to invest a lot of money there, but I think it'll be money well spent, particularly as long as the authorizing committee is really keeping their eye on the ball. And just final point, I took a lot of time here, but I wanted a lot of my colleagues to hear this stuff, because I think it's very important that both these bills get a big bipartisan vote. I think they're really good bills. I think your committee did a really, really excellent job here, and look forward to working with both of you, or all of you, to try and make sure that this gets across the floor with substantial vote on each side of the aisle, because I think both these merit that kind of support because of the committee work and because of the way you guys came together in committee. So anyway, well done. Yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Perlmutter.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to echo much of what Mr. Cole just said, but first I want to recognize and introduce a young woman from my area, Louisa Wilson, who won our Congressional Art Competition, and she will have her art hanging in the Capitol now for the next year, so welcome.
Bravo.
What I wanted to say, and I agree with Mr. Cole, Mr. Pallone's been up in front of our committee a lot. And many of the bills have been controversial, and there's been a lot of disagreement on them. And these two are so important, and for you all to have reached this kind of consensus is really heartening. And so first thing I'd like to talk about a little bit is the research bill. So although, Mr. Guthrie, I think it's a little more prescriptive than I would like, it sounds to me like you're comfortable with the guardrails you put in it. And Ms. Eshel, you're comfortable with the ability of the agency to really do some innovative, inventive, imaginative things. So I'll just let you comment on it, quickly, because I don't want to take too much time. And I do want to talk about the mental health bill.
No, my confidence has increased as we have moved along. I think the bill has just gotten better and better as we have refined things. And if I might, credit is due to the chairman because he supported the project early on. He thought it was an important idea. Dr. Burgess has really been key in this. And of course, no, you have.
Right, you might end up killing the bill. We might end up voting against the thing. So
No,
watch
but,
yourself.
there are so many that deserve credit. So, yes, I support the changes. I think they're healthy changes.
Thank you, Mr. Guthrie.
Yeah. As it's defined, so what we want to make sure they didn't just do general research, and this is what we want them to do, and it's defined in the bill as transformative health technologies as drugs, biological products, platform tools, or devices that detect, diagnose, mitigate, prevent, cure, or treat serious disease or medical condition, and I can go on, but which are unmet needs, and there's a regulatory risk or uncertainty for the private sector to invest in. And so I think if they focus just on that, even though that's prescriptive, I think that's where we want them to focus.
All right, thank you. With respect to the HOPE for mental health, that one, there are two subjects that are particularly important in my district. One of them, one of my daughters, who is currently due any time, this is with her second little girl, has been very vocal on the mental health of mothers and the pressure both pre and postpartum, and the fact that they need potentially some additional assistance. And so I'm very Happy that the bill addresses that, and then obviously suicide prevention. We really have seen far too much in that area, and so Mr. Pallone, I don't know if you want to comment, but
just,
I'm really thankful you two have addressed this in the bill.
Well, I would just mention that I think most of you know that beginning July 1st, I think it is, we launched the 988 National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, the dialing code, and which I think is significant. But in the bill, there's, to back that up, there's a Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration Behavioral Health Crisis Coordination, basically coordination office, and development of crisis response best practices that are linked to that new launch of that new 988 number. And
I
there's
need to speak more into the mic.
I'm sorry, I don't know if this, does the
Sorry.
red indicate that it's on or off?
Red is on.
Red is on, okay. I'll just speak. So I was saying, with the launch of that new 988 suicide prevention dialing code, we have a coordination office and crisis response best practices that are linked to that in the bill, and also support for additional adult suicide prevention services and treatment, particularly as I mentioned, for children and pregnant or postpartum women, peer support, and a lot of the things the types of things that you mentioned, Mr. Perlmutter.
Thank you for the work on this. Thanks for bringing us, instead of us fighting on these two major subjects, we're actually going to move this forward. So thank you very much. I yield back.
Dr. Burgess.
Thank you. I'll have a chance to talk about this a lot on the floor tomorrow. And as you can see, I'm losing my voice, so let me save that for tomorrow. But there are a couple of things I do have to say. And Chairman Issue, you're way too kind. I was not a believer in ARPA-H when the concept was first brought to me. And to your credit, your staff's credit, you listened very patiently. I was extremely concerned about the amount of bureaucratic drag that was being built in as we first considered the language. But I think from a Rules Committee perspective, this is so unusual. We normally don't see bills that have come through subcommittee hearings, subcommittee markups, full committee markups. So this really is a testament to the Energy and Commerce Committee itself. It really did. This is important work, and as Mr. Cole knows, sometimes I sound like a whiny authorizer, but the authorizing committees are where the real work gets done, or is supposed to get done. And when we, for whatever reason, can't or won't do that work, the product we end up with is nowhere near as satisfactory. So I'm really appreciative of the limitations around what can be spent for so-called indirect cost or overhead costs. We want the money to go for research. That's the whole idea of this. And the fact that you've built those protections in, I think, is extremely important. And when Secretary Becerra came and talked to our committee on the budget hearing, and he talked about how this would be located at the campus of NIH, I thought, oh, all the air went out of the balloon. If you're going to do that, it's almost not worth doing. Because as you mentioned, Chairwoman Issue, the culture issue is important, and we heard from a number of witnesses and stakeholders where it's almost as if it's not an agency problem, but it's a personality problem, and you get so far and you can't get beyond that. So I think you've really made some significant strides here, and I know you've got work to do over on the other side of the Capitol. Would be helpful to you. With one of the ways to be helpful, I think, as Mr. Cole said, is to get this through with a big bipartisan vote, and so I'm looking forward to that as well. Chairman Pallone, I'm struggling because I don't want to take the challenge that you posed to me, but I do feel obligated to say, look, I understand what you're trying to do. You want to make sure that people who prescribe opiates understand what they're doing and how potent they are. We do take 4 years of medical school. I mean, that has not changed. But it's what I brought up in committee, and I think it's important, and I need to say it again, and I'll say it again tomorrow on the floor. When we worked on the Support Act in previous Congresses, a couple of Congresses ago, this was a different disease. Overdose deaths were, yeah, maybe the problem was an oral surgeon prescribing too many Percocet after wisdom tooth extraction. And they would get diverted and find their way into places they shouldn't be. But now the problem is fentanyl poisoning. And it's an active attack on our country by the Chinese communists. And this poison is brought into our streets across the Texas border. So it's painful for me to see our physicians perhaps being tasked with yet another burden to overcome when they are not the problem. So you're fighting a 2015 problem today when we really need to be focused on a 2022 problem. And the problem is no border security, and for whatever reason, the People's Republic of China has found it worthwhile to distribute fentanyl unrestricted in our country, and that's where we really need to focus.
Not respond because I've learned my lesson here. I think I'm doing well with him, so I think I should just leave well enough alone. Let me just say, I apologize that I have to leave, but the two leaders of the Health Subcommittee they can certainly answer questions about the mental health bill as well, so I apologize. I'm leaving you in good hands.
Well, I've registered my reservations. I do thank you for you and Ranking Member Worth Rogers did a lot of hard work to get this to the place where it can come to the floor. And again, as Mr. Cole said, I do think it's important we get a good, strong bipartisan vote. And I expect that will be the outcome, at least on these two bills. I can't speak to the rest of them that we're going to hear today.
Thanks.
Thank you, and I'll yield back.
Take care.
Thank you.
Ms. Scanlon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And obviously, as a research and development hub in Pennsylvania, we're very appreciative of the resources that'll be going towards expanding those biotech, life sciences opportunities there. I wanted to just look a little bit at the mental health provisions that we're considering, particularly since that's been such a focus in my region, particularly around the millions of young people who are struggling with helplessness, depression, thoughts of suicide. That was before COVID-19 upended their lives, also before the surge in gun violence upended their lives. And I had teachers and students talking to me just this past weekend about the fact that having to participate in active shooter drills has really impacted mental health among our students in a very, very negative way. A place that should be safe is now actively portrayed as dangerous on a monthly basis whenever they have to have these drills. So I am very concerned about that. But I'm glad we're putting some resources to it. I hope that we can look at that issue and whether these active shooter drills are doing more harm than good, as was suggested by students and teachers. Also looking forward to additional resources on the opioid issues, opioid/fentanyl, whether the prescriptions led to other kinds of abuse or whatever. Certainly it's something that folks in our region have struggled with. So can you just kind of summarize perhaps how this bill is going to make an impact going forward? I mean, just to kind of put it in plain English for a minute.
Well, I think the following. We didn't add any new agencies in that, but the opportunity before us was this. It's really this time around the experience of every single member in their congressional district. There isn't a district that hasn't been affected. We've met with families, we've met with the nonprofits, we've gone to memorial services, and that experience and knowledge gained by members is manifested in the changes of what we not only reauthorize, but what we changed in those reauthorizations, so that when something was missing at SAMHSA, and we questioned, we had good hearings on these, on all of these issues, members from both sides fully engaged. I believe that this is a different product because it's a different time. And these issues are so real in our community, and they're tragedies. And, maybe at one time it was just the inner city. This is all over the place. So, I think that we come to you with this legislation having built very carefully all the aspects of not only addiction, but what can be done at the front end in the detection of depression of young people. We know where that can lead them, but investing early on, but there has to be a continuum. We have all heard from families, they got to a certain point in the food chain, so to speak, and then the bottom falls out. They don't have services for a certain aspect of, in terms of what's needed. So without going through all 30 of them, I always think we need to do more, most frankly. And there are other bills where we've addressed depressed mothers, especially what comes with postpartum. And one of the things that we did was to make sure that Medicaid continues to cover them for a full year. They no sooner needed postpartum services and they were cut off. And so I think that there are many policies that we've developed at Energy and Commerce and through the Health Committee that are going to address that because the statistics for the United States are shameful, especially for Black women.
Well, and we just had an article in the Philadelphia Inquirer yesterday or this morning about the fact that maternal mortality statistics in our region are higher than average, and that so many of the issues arise about 6 months after birth. So that Medicaid expansion has been really important.
Very important.
Is there something you wanted to
Yeah,
say?
that was one, just a Medicaid expansion for maternal health is important. But the other one, I mentioned it earlier, is where not every young person who's committed these violent crimes that we've seen has been in the justice system, but some are. And so when you get in the justice system, you typically use your Medicaid benefits. And so while we make sure that juveniles in the justice system maintain their Medicaid benefits to maintain their mental health support as they move forward. And the other one is, I didn't realize really until we really dug into it that most of the school nurses are there, he or she are in the schools because of the Medicaid program. And a lot of school systems that have bigger administrative, there are fewer in rural schools than in bigger city schools. And the reason is just the sophistication of dealing with the red tape in the Medicaid program. And so there's a directive in here, you might have come up with that, I know we worked on it together, that says that the CMS has to remove the red tape so that it allows expansion of more of these. They're already eligible for it, it's just getting it. For rural schools to be able to bill Medicaid for, I know in my district, most of the rural schools have a heavy Medicaid population. And so they would be able to afford a school nurse just through Medicaid, and we make that easier.
Sure, and that's always been an issue in the special education field, is that some of the service can be provided by Medicaid, some through the school system, but making that more seamless is
Yeah,
really
if
helpful.
they're on Medicaid or IEP, like you said, that's
Yeah.
particularly, they do qualify for Medicaid assistance, and so we make it easier for them for that to happen in this
Sounds good.
bill.
Well, thank you for your work on that, and I'll yield back.
I think what you just said, that would allow them to hire a nurse. So many students do not have access to, a nurse at their school, just to be able to take their medication because those resources haven't been made significantly available to all of our schools.
Can I just clarify that? So they're already allowed to hire a nurse, and so, but what this makes it easier for them to bill Medicaid for that nurse's
Yes.
services? So it helps pay for that nurse in the school
Right.
system.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
It's the paid for that is
That's right.
necessary.
So we didn't
It's always the
authorize,
money.
we authorized them to pay for it, yeah.
Yeah.
Mr. Reschenthaler.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate it. Just wanted to start off by congratulating the student that won the competition. I'm not sure if she is still here, but I wanted to offer congratulations.
Took some great pictures.
Well, please let her know that she was still the center of attention for a period of time in the committee, Mr. Perlmutter. I appreciate it. And I just want to flag something for the committee. I'm offering amendment number 2 to 7666 with my good friend from New York, Mr. Morelli. Hopefully this will just be made in order, but what it is, it's a comprehensive, it would call for and require a comprehensive study on the cost of serious mental illness on the federal government. I think it's a really good first step so we can say, look, this is costing this amount of money. If we would just invest another amount of money into mental health treatment, it would actually reduce costs over the long term, of course, get a lot of people care that need care. And I just wanted to reference my predecessor and really good friend, Tim Murphy, who worked on this.
He did.
It's an honor to take up the mantle. So shameless plug for amendment number 2, but Mr. Morelli and I would appreciate it if everybody voted yes on that. Mr. Guthrie, I did have a question about subawards. I know we were talking about you with Ranking Member Cole. We're talking about some issues with preventing money from going, to example, to communist China. I know that's prohibited in the bill, but I'm still really concerned about subawards because as we saw through EcoHealth Alliance, for example, EcoHealth Alliance, it is based in New York City, yet they filtered the money through to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So is there anything in this bill that would prevent subawards from going to adversarial nations?
Yeah, well, they're explicitly prohibited under the 1119C of the National Security Act of 1947. The ones I mentioned, Russian Federation, People's Republic of China, Iran, People's Republic of Iran, or the Islamic Republic of Iran, and Democratic People's Republic of Korea. So those are explicitly, and so the question is, do they get backdoored into that area? I think you're moving forward. Well, the agency director has to report, make a report on any foreign group that, so if you partner with an American, it has to go through an American U.S. citizen or a U.S. company, I guess is the right way to say it. And then if anything that they partner with a foreign entity would have to be disclosed.
Thanks, I appreciate it. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I assume the subject of the Colorado art was a portrait of the distinguished gentleman from Colorado. I'm sure that's how the individual benefited from winning the competition. I want to thank Mr. Reschenthaler for his partnership, and we at least have 2 out of 13 votes. Maybe we can work on the others to make sure the amendment's made in order, but it is an important amendment. And one of the other things that I just wanted to thank the chair and the other members who are here today for their work on the legislation. And particularly, I just wanted to highlight, as others have, ARPA-H, which I think is critical legislation that revolutionizes potentially how our nation invests in cures to some of the deadliest diseases affecting Americans every single day. And, I think our biomedical industry has demonstrated incredible success over the years, making investments in immunotherapies and the great use of messenger RNA vaccines, and have allowed the development of invaluable tools that will fight a variety of illnesses, obviously COVID, Alzheimer's, cancer. And as someone who lost a daughter to a rare form of breast cancer, it is a very personal issue. And too many families are still faced with a diagnosis that can leave them feeling a sense of hopelessness, not knowing what treatment options exist or how much time a loved one has. And so we can certainly leave it to the biomedical sector to continue the progress they're making, but patients don't always have the time required for significant medical research. And we know that there's a gap in incentives, which prevents some of the most promising therapies to be developed. And I think particularly when you look at what's happened with DARPA and our advances there, and obviously it's a completely different perspective, but it's the acceleration of technologies by investment by the federal government for primarily military and defense purposes. But it really does bring together there academicians, industry partners, government partners, and I think that model is really an apt model for the kind of advances that we can make, and particularly help us be able to compete at the same time with some of our peer adversaries around the globe, like China. So I think we're showcasing our commitment to families and patients and ensuring that we're cementing our position as a global leader in this space in the development of new technologies and new ways to prevent, treat, diagnose, cure illness. And I would hope this legislation will provide people who face a difficult moment in their lives, sometimes very life-altering moments, that they can rely on the work that we do, and I think this will make a great difference. So I just wanted to thank you all
Thank you.
for your work, and with that, I'll yield back, Madam Chair.
That's lovely.
Ms. Fishbaugh.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You know, I really, really appreciate the opportunity to discuss a bipartisan bill. It's truly bipartisan. We don't always get that in the body here, and so I appreciate that, and the fact that it does really truly appear to be bipartisan, that it was worked on together. But I just have a couple of questions, and to either one of the panelists, Mr. Guthrie or Madam Chair. I'm from a rural area, and so I'm just kind of wondering if there's anything here. You know, I hear a lot from farmers who are struggling, getting more stressed out with prices and all the things, drought and tornadoes, whatever may be going on, but there's obviously more stress, and I'm just wondering if there's anything in here that's directed for the mental health of those highly stressful.
Yeah, a couple of things. I think you stepped out when I mentioned, and I want to reiterate, but there's provisions in here to make it easier for rural schools to build Medicaid for services, makes it more affordable for them to have a nurse in the school system. We've seen in research, I guess I'm getting deeper than what I already said, but we've seen in research that more urban with that have more administrative ability schools have school nurses, and a lot of it's billed to Medicaid, where a lot of rural schools don't, particularly my district, probably the same in yours, because it's too difficult to do. They would make it affordable for these nurses to be on site. And then the second thing is that John Curtis has a provision in this bill that is in this bill that focuses on healthcare workers in rural areas and training for rural areas moving forward. And there's some provisions, we're still under the emergency order with telehealth. And so we have to make sure there's some provisions for telehealth in here as well. But that is something as a committee, we're just gonna have to look at, and as a Congress, to make sure once the emergency order is removed for the pandemic, that we have adequate telehealth services throughout rural. It's been a big benefit to my district as well, so. But there are those specific provisions in here, and there is telehealth, but we need to have a broader bill to come to you in the near future with that as well.
Well, and I appreciate the provisions for rural areas, because they don't always, rural areas tend to get overlooked quite a bit, and so I appreciate that. But I'm wondering, did you look at all at some of those more stressful careers? You know, like you look at and maybe that's not, maybe it's for a later bill, but just kind of curious. You know, like you have farming, you have mental, health professionals have, additional. Just kind of curious.
Yeah, well, the thing that you might answer, but the one thing, then I'll turn it over to Chair Issue, is that one of the beauties of the block grant is that it is truly a block grant. So each state and each community, I have Bowling Green where I live, which is it could be in Sherman, Plone suburban, not enter close to the city, but outside, Applebee's, those kind of places all over, just a growing southern town. And then I've got areas that have really lost population and shrinking. And so we have to focus on all of that to move forward. And so we're telehealth helps in that area and so forth. So we are focused on that. And you want to?
Yeah, I would just add, thank you for your questions. I mean, they're highly legitimate. First of all, in the testimony and in the discussion amongst members on both sides of the aisle, those that have rural parts of their district or a full rural district always were front and center. I mean, they made their needs known. All of these programs are not, for a certain age group. So yes, Medicaid, nurses in schools, but really most of the programs span all ages. They span all ages. So when you speak of the farmers and their stress, they're adults, they would benefit. And there's the enforcement of mental health parity, and that's very important in rural areas. I mean, they've really been overlooked, really overlooked. And more prescribers for medication-assisted treatment, another issue that was raised that's particular to rural areas.
And I lost my train of thought as I was explaining. So our block grant that Representative Tonko and I worked on is truly a block grant. So even within my district, there are different needs. And I know yours as well. So it gives your state government and your legislators and your governor the flexibility to make it apply to where it's best. I mean, what happens in Silicon Valley and what happens in my district are two different things. And so people have the same problems, but there are different approaches to it. And so that's what the idea behind the block grant was, and why we really protected it to be a block grant.
And I appreciate that, because when I was in the legislature, you know, we put money into mental health, particularly for farmers, and I appreciate the telehealth, and I know that we are still under that order right now, but I also want everyone to understand too that it's not the answer to everything, and that we need to make sure. So, Madam Chair, when you talk about parity, that's huge, and so I want to make sure that we continue to address those rural issues. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Ross?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank the members of the Energy and Commerce Committee for doing such important bipartisan work. HR 766 comes at a crucial time. Even before the pandemic, the support system for Americans living with mental illness was insufficient, and I know about this. My dad's a retired psychiatrist. In the past 2 years, we've seen a dramatic rise in global mental illness associated with anxiety, depression, and collective grief. And we owe it to our constituents to provide equal access to health care for mental illnesses and substance abuse disorders. In my home state, almost 45% of North Carolinians reported symptoms of anxiety or depression in February 2021, with more than 22% unable to get necessary care, largely because of prohibitive costs. Almost 130,000 children aged 12 through 17 in North Carolina suffer from adolescent depression, and this is all over the country and all over the world. More than half of these children did not receive any care at all in the past year. And once they reach high school, they're twice as likely to drop out if they don't get this kind of care. These statistics tell just part of the story of families disrupted, educations delayed, and the barriers facing Americans striving to achieve their full potential and well-being. This bipartisan bill will significantly bolster Americans' access to mental health services. And as was just mentioned, I am particularly pleased that it boosts compliance with mental health parity laws. I served in the state legislature when we passed such a law well before the Affordable Care Act, and it's still not achieving its full potential. It also supports mental health care through telehealth and reauthorizes key programs that fund mental health services. What a wonderful contribution at the right time. And as for HR 5585, for decades, the United States has been a leader in biomedical research around the world. Historically, biomedical research has been driven by two components: research at the NIH and industry research that supports the creation of products to treat diseases. But recently, our country has shown signs of slowing in this sector. Promising research opportunities are put on hold due to high costs, complex coordination, long wait periods, and many other factors. North Carolina was the first state in the country to have a state-supported entity dedicated to promoting growth of the life sciences industry after the creation of the North Carolina Biotechnology Center in 1984. In my district of Wake County, the Research Triangle Park stands as the largest research park in North America, with many, many biotech companies. Founded in 1959, RTP remains North Carolina's premier global innovation center and one of the most successful science parks in the world. There are over 600 life science companies employing over 24,000 people in RTP. ARPA-H will have a profound influence in North Carolina and help our economy and the well-being of Americans across the country. It will appropriate $500 million each year for the next 5 years and fund groundbreaking research to continue to save American lives. We want to remain the leader in biomedical research across the globe. I support both of these bills and urge my colleagues to do the same and congratulate the committee on your outstanding work.
Thank you very much.
I yield back.
Thank you. I see Mr. Nagus signed on. Did you have any questions? Okay, hearing no response, does any other member of the committee wish to ask a question?
Just had one question.
Mr. Perlmutter.
Mr. Pallone mentioned something, Butte? Well, did anybody hear that?
Who's talking?
Is that Butte now?
Buprenorphine, buprenorphine. He was trying to
Buprenorphine.
say buprenorphine.
Okay,
He abbreviated it on purpose because it's a tongue twister.
all right, thank you.
But it didn't work in this case because he still asked the question. Okay, seeing that there are no other questions, yeah. I would like to thank our witnesses
you.
for their testimony. Please leave with our stenographer or submit electronically anything that you would like inserted into the record. You're now excused. We will hear from any amendment witnesses on HR 5585 and HR 7666 at the end of the hearing portion of today's meeting. I'd like to welcome our witnesses to provide testimony on HR 4176, the LGBTQI+ Data Inclusion Act. And I think we just clear the room. Chairwoman Maloney, Ranking Member Comer, we are delighted that you are here with us. Yeah. Very nice to see you. I now recognize the gentlewoman from New York, Chairwoman Maloney.
Chairwoman Torres, for having us here today, and I'm proud to bring before you H.R. 4176, the LGBTQI+ Data Inclusion Act. And what this bill would do is this bill was introduced by myself and Raul Grijalva, and it would close longstanding gaps in the collection of data pertaining to our nation's LGBTQI+. We particularly saw this during COVID. There was no information collected. It's not collected anywhere in the government, and we do collect information on everybody else. This will equip Congress and federal agencies with the tools we need to better understand the specific challenges that these communities face, and by ensuring that federal surveys, including the U.S. Census, collect data on sexual orientation, gender identity, and variations in sex characteristics. This bill will provide policymakers with the crucial data that they need to tailor policy solutions that support and help these communities. The LGBTQI Data Inclusion Act has wide support, over 120 co-sponsors, and it has received the support of over 200 different coalitions of civil rights and scientific organizations, as well as a very strong endorsement from the Equality Caucus. This legislation builds on the Biden administration's efforts to advance equity for the LGBTQI+ community population. That includes the president's recently announced executive order, which would facilitate the collection of federal data pertaining to the LGBTQI people. Under the bill, responses to federal data inquiries would be totally voluntary and would also be held to very high privacy standards so that it would be protected. A recent report from the Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine affirmed the need to achieve more inclusive data collection across the federal government. And such data can reveal disparities and opportunities and can inform policies that lead to better outcomes for all populations. In recent days, this sentiment has been echoed in letters of support from key stakeholders and thought leaders across the country, including the Human Rights Campaign, the Center for American Progress, the Whitman Walker Institute, and more. I want to conclude by thanking Grijalva for his leadership, Chairman Grijalva, and his partnership in this crucial work, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you, Chairwoman. I now recognize the gentleman from Kentucky, Ranking Member Comer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The LGBTQI+ Data Inclusion Act requires federal agencies to collect highly sensitive information from the American people. With Americans facing record inflation, record gas prices, supply chain shortages, and skyrocketing drug overdoses, it's unbelievable. This is House Democrats' priority. Mortgage rates are the highest level since 2008. Inflation's at the highest rate in 40 years. Nationally, gas prices are averaging over $5 a gallon. There's a severe shortage of baby formula across our country. It's been a free-for-all at the southern border since President Biden took office, both for illegal immigrants and deadly drugs. Important questions remain ignored, such as questions about the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan. Democrats have no interest in investigating the origins of the COVID pandemic or the impact their shutdowns and school closures have had on American children. But today, we are considering a divisive bill that does not solve America's biggest problems. As I noted, H.R. 4176 requires federal agencies to include questions regarding sexual orientation and gender identity on their surveys. There are over 130 such surveys across federal agencies. This includes the census. My Democrat colleagues oppose asking whether someone is an American citizen on the census because they say it could deter participation. But they want to ask about sexual orientation or gender identity, subjects many Americans would not want to share with the federal government. This could certainly reduce participation rates. And I'd like to remind the members of this committee that asking these questions during a job interview is illegal. My Democrat colleagues say this bill will expand funding and services for those who identify as LGBTQI+, but we do not know how agencies will actually use this information. And we do not know how bad actors would seek to exploit this information either. Federal agencies are constantly the targets of cyber attacks and subject to leaks. A Chinese attack on the Office of Personnel Management exposed the data of millions of Americans. The IRS leaked tax information on high-profile Americans to the press. This information could be used for harmful purposes, so Americans may be reluctant to risk answering a survey entirely. Democrats say that these intrusive questions will remain optional under the bill, but we all know the pressure respondents will feel to answer a federal agency survey. And in fact, the bill sponsor's amendment before the Rules Committee strikes the, quote, exemption from penalty, unquote, provision which protected survey respondents from fine or other penalty if they refuse to answer a question. We do not know why this is being removed at the final hour, but it reflects the lack of due diligence this bill has gone through up to this point in the process. Another troubling aspect of the bill is how it allows observers or proxies to fill out these surveys on behalf of others. Republicans have concerns with other people answering highly personal questions for somebody else. This proxy could either make an educated guess, or a person would have to tell this proxy their sexual orientation or gender identity, something they may not want to discuss. Mr. Cloud offered an amendment to strike this provision, but committee Democrats rejected it. And Republicans have concerns presenting children with questions about sexual orientation or gender identity. Why should a minor be confronted by such topics? For instance, the National Survey of Fishing, Hunting, and Wildlife Associated Recreation includes respondents as young as 6 years old. The debate around LGBTQI+ is highly divisive to many Americans. They have deep concerns about an agenda built around an ever-evolving array of identities, especially when it comes to children. Many parents have grave concerns that advocates of this agenda are seeking to indoctrinate their children and drive a wedge within their families. Federal surveys are no place to confront the American people or their children with intrusive questions and concerns about sexual orientation or gender identity. Democrats have not addressed or even acknowledged these concerns. In the committee markup of 4176, Mr. Groffman offered an amendment to prohibit the collection of this information from minors. Democrats voted it down unanimously. The U.S. House of Representatives should focus on helping the American people survive the economic turmoil and defending our borders and national security. We should be conducting oversight of the Biden administration. It's our constitutional responsibility. But instead, we're spending time on divisive messaging bills. I oppose H.R. 4176 and urge my colleagues to do the same. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you to both of you for your comments. As we celebrate Pride Month this June, I want to take this opportunity and take a moment to acknowledge the strength, resiliency of the LGBTQI+ community and the progress that has been made toward equality. We have come a long way in this country in standing up for equality and increased visibility of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. They're people. They're our fellow Americans. However, we know that the LGBTQI+ community continues to face higher rates of poverty, hate crimes, unemployment, health disparities, and workplace discrimination. Just last week, President Biden issued several historic executive orders to combat attacks on members of the LGBTQI+ community. And I applaud the president for standing up to the bullies, especially those Republican state legislatures across the country that are passing hateful, discriminatory LGBTQI+ bills. Like, don't say gay. I say gay every day. From discriminating to the awful practice of conversion therapy, to promoting gender-affirming care and LGBTQI+ foster youth protections, the president made it clear that no one should have to face discrimination or hostility for just being who they are. We must do more in Congress to ensure that no child or person is prevented from living their true selves, and members of the LGBTQI+ community are no longer prosecuted. At the federal level, one of the ways that we can support and help deliver critical services and outreach to the LGBTQI+ community is by passing the legislation before us today, H.R. 4176, the LGBTQI+ Data Inclusion Act. This legislation would require federal agencies to collect voluntary, let me say that again, voluntary. If you don't want to give up that data, you don't have to. That's what that means. Demographic survey data so that we can better understand and serve the LGBTQI+ community and help deliver critical services to those in need. Many states and localities, including my home state of California, have already started to collect data from LGBTQI+ people, which has helped policymakers improve their lives. We didn't have a choice but to begin to collect this data because we were seeing an influx of runaways. Take shelter, come to our state and take shelter. They are American asylum seekers from other states who have passed legislation and continue to promote the bullying of our constituents. California has embraced them, and California sees them, and California will continue to do everything that it can to protect them. But we have to understand where they are coming from. We can do this at the federal level and on a much larger scale, and I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 4176. And I will now turn to the ranking member, Mr. Cole, for any comments or questions he may have.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I think sometimes, bills become symbolic, but we need to stop and look at the substance. Does the bill really accomplish what it purports to accomplish? In this case, I think it clearly doesn't. But let me ask you, Ranking Member Comer, will provisions of this legislation ensure data integrity? And if not, what's the impact of poor data?
Well, Mr. Cole, nothing in this bill ensures answers are accurate. As was mentioned in the description of the bill, you don't have to answer the question. So if you're doing surveys and you don't have to answer the question, then I don't know how the government's going to be able to determine the accuracy of the survey. Respondents are likely to provide untruthful answers or no answers at all to such intrusive questions related to their own sexuality, which threatens the integrity and accuracy of the survey data. And poor and imprecise data will result in wrong programs being supported or funded by limited taxpayer dollars. So.
I don't know, you may have addressed this in your comments. Are there existing federal surveys that collect this type of information in more accurate manner? And does the Census Bureau have the existing authority to add these questions if it felt it needed to?
The Census Bureau has already started asking federal survey questions related to sexual orientation and gender on its Household Pulse survey. But we should not be codifying these policies into law.
I understand that this legislation allows another person to interpret and categorize a person's sexual orientation and identity subject to their own biases. Is that true? And what are some of the intended or unintended consequences of allowing one person to categorize the sexual identity of another person?
Well, I think collecting the information only served to further divide us rather than working to unite us in our common humanity and American heritage. By allowing another person to categorize one's sexuality, this legislation risks the sexualization of minors, for example. No child should be asked inappropriate questions concerning their sexuality beyond their comprehension or biological maturity.
And one last question. Did the committee hold a legislative hearing to hear testimony from agencies that would be impacted by the bill?
No. The chairwoman cites an April 7th subcommittee on civil rights and civil liberties hearing entitled Free Speech Under Attack, Book Bans and Academic Censorship as the legislative hearing. However, that hearing did not cover the bill's policy focus. Neither the census nor federal data collections were mentioned during the hearing. So we should be hearing from the Census Bureau or other lead agencies in conducting surveys.
Thank you. Yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Scanlon?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, for bringing this bill before us. It's been suggested that somehow the bill would be harmful to people in the LGBTQI+ community. Has the bill been endorsed by advocacy groups?
Absolutely. In fact, the National Academies put out a report which found that complete and accurate information was needed for the LGBTQI+ community because of the special problems that they confront. And I'd like to place in the record the over 200 organizations that have endorsed the bill, along with over 124 members of our body. But it was requested, obviously, from the community.
Without objection.
Thank you. And it was requested from the community itself. They have been pushing for this. And as the gentleman pointed out, we do have surveys. We have a lot of surveys. We survey women, we survey men, we survey children, the environment, we survey everything. We are not surveying or even looking at the LGBTQ+ community. And They deserve the same attention and support. We also know that there's increased violence. I know in my own community, I regretfully say, there's increased violence against the LGBTQI plus community. They are now identified as a hate crime, which is extreme actions against a particular community. As Edmund Burke says, there is no issue that is so controversial that it cannot be studied. Data, we're talking about data collection. We're not talking about policy changes. We're talking about collecting data to better understand challenges, to understand people, to understand how people reacted in COVID, why people may be targeted and attacked in our society, trying to understand how we can move to a more just and tolerant society. As I said, this is supported completely by the community. They have asked for it, and as the chair lady pointed out, it is Pride Month, and they asked specifically that it be considered during Pride Month as a special priority of their concern. This bill has been before Congress for a number of years. President Biden, I'm very flattered that he took the bill and turned it into an executive order, so the president is behind it. I'd like to place in the record his statement of support of the bill. And again, what we're talking about is information, science. All the scientific organizations support this bill as important for us to understand people, to understand what is happening in our communities, what is happening in people's lives. And we're talking about collecting information. That's all it is. What is so frightening or negative about collecting information? And as the chair lady pointed out, even more dramatically than I could in my statement, that this is totally voluntary. We're trying to be helpful, and we're responding to the requests of a community to collect this information. They feel threatened. They feel more information needs to be understood about their lives, about their health, and this is what it is. It's data collection. It's not policy change. It's information. And I think that we should always support information. I think it's very telling that we do scientific research in so many areas, but it's completely lacking almost in the LGBTQI plus community. There's no data as you pointed out, you're right. My ranking member and I usually agree on a lot of things. Not always.
We do.
Not always. We pass some important bills together. But this is, we disagree on this one, and I don't quite understand because it's not a policy change. It's just collecting information. And as a former teacher, I think information's important. It has to be scientific, it has to be accurate, and it only strengthens our country when we understand more about our country and our people. I yield back. Thank you for the question, Ms. Scanlon.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the information about the organizations that have
Yes.
supported it, to clarify
Again.
that. I would add, obviously, the Congressional LGBTQ plus Equality Caucus supports the legislation, and the chair, Mr. Sicilian, made
200
statements about it as well.
organizations, 200.
Yeah, I mean, the data can help inform our legislation, and I appreciate this opportunity to push forward with getting more data. So thank you.
Thank you.
I yield back.
Dr. Burgess.
Thank you. As I pointed out, I'll get a chance to talk about all of our bills tomorrow a lot on the floor. So in the interest of time, I'll yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Morale. Mr. Reschenthaler.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ranking Member Comer, it wasn't too long ago that our friends across the aisle were saying that it was inappropriate to ask the census if somebody was a citizen or not. And again, that was incredibly relevant because it went to apportionment. Do you have any comments on the hypocrisy here where now it's okay to ask even more intrusive questions?
Thank you for that question. I mean, with all due respect, the hypocrisy is breathtaking on this. I could make a very strong argument that if we're going to ask a question, add a question to the census or any federal surveys, that question should be, are you legal in the United States? Are you here legally in the United States? Are you a citizen of the United States? You think about all the tax dollars that we're spending with 2 million plus illegals have crossed into our country over the last year. Just think how much that's affecting the taxpayers of America, how much that's costing to house these unaccompanied minors, to educate these children in public schools that speak little to no English, that get on Medicaid, that are being transported and being flown around the state, that are being fed. This is a huge expense, and we don't know how many people are here illegally. So we've had an amendment in committee. Mr. Biggs filed an amendment to ask the question that the former president wanted on the last census: are you a legal citizen of the United States? And the Democrats voted that down unanimously. But here they say today, we don't need to know if you're here legally or not, but we do need to know if you're gay. I disagree with that, and I think most Americans would as well.
Madam Chair, I'll yield to you. Just let me finish this line of questions. If memory serves me correctly, we were told that the reason we couldn't ask about whether or not the individual was a citizen or not was that it was somehow going to deter participation, or at least that was the pretext that we were told. Don't you think that this will do more to deter participation in these federal surveys than asking somebody if they're a citizen? I mean, this is incredibly private information.
Absolutely. I think that this would do much more to deter participation than the citizenship question. And I think the citizenship question is significantly more important to the American taxpayers than their sexual identity.
Madam Chair, I know you wanted to speak. I'm yielding.
Thank you. I respectfully disagree with my good friend and colleague. Citizenship questions should not be part of this bill. The Trump administration's efforts to add the citizenship question to the census was a fear tactic used to discourage specific people from participating in the census and to exclude them from the count. The Supreme Court ruled in this case, that the Trump administration stated reasoning for adding the citizenship question was, quote, pretextual. In other words, it was a lie. And they had scientific and information that proves that they wanted to add the question in order to discourage certain communities from answering the citizenship, answering or filling out their census. And unlike the citizenship question, these questions will be voluntary, and respondents' privacy will be vigorously protected. And unlike the citizenship question, collecting data on sexual orientation, gender identity, and variations in sex characteristics will allow individuals to receive the proper care and resources they need to thrive. A lot of times we do surveys to understand what is needed and how to address concerns before us. And with that, I yield back. This is extremely different from the citizenship question, which according to the Supreme Court should not have been asked and was deemed as a means to discourage communities from filling out their census forms.
Mr. Comer?
If we're going to spend tax dollars expanding the questions on these federal surveys, if you don't have to answer it truthfully, then what's the point of listing it on the survey? How is that going to be? And what are you going to do with this information? I just don't see the need for this. Again, if we're going to ask one, if we get the choice to ask one additional question on the census or any federal survey, the Republicans on the Oversight Committee strongly believe that that question should be a citizenship question.
Well, I was going to ask, what is the compelling reason for asking this question?
That you're asking the wrong person. We asked that during the markup and really didn't get any answer. Again, they keep saying, well, you don't have to answer this question truthfully. You don't have to answer this question. Well, then why are you asking it? And what are you going to do with the data? I can't answer that. I don't think it's necessary. I think this is a waste. I think with all the problems in the world and all the oversight that's needed in this current administration, this is totally opposite of where we need to be focusing our attention on the Oversight Committee.
May I respond to that too?
Yes, Madam Chair.
From the limited research that we already have, we understand that LGBTQI people disproportionately experience poverty, housing insecurity, adverse physical and mental health outcomes, discrimination, and much more. As I said earlier, this is requested from the Human Rights Campaign, the major advocacy group for this community. And this year, the National Academies and other scientific organizations put out a report which found that complete and accurate demographic information on the LGBTQI+ community should be standardized and collected. When we collect information, then we're able to see problems, how to cure them, how to act on them. The report showed that only a limited number of federal surveys collect data on sexual orientation and gender identity, and that none collect data on intersex populations. This bill, the Data Inclusion Act, would greatly improve our data collection efforts. And as I said, data on anything is just a means of research to see if the problem exists and how to address it. This would help ensure that federal programs and services can reach every person in the United States with the greatest effectiveness and efficiency. And it would help us understand and address longstanding health and economic inequities for America's LGBTQI population. Collecting this data is critically important to ensure that our policy meets the needs of this community and our constituents. For example, without the collection of this data, states were not able to measure the impact on LGBTQI individuals, leaving pandemic response programs at risk of neglecting these individuals. And collecting this data also moves us towards a more inclusive, I would say, an equitable society. According to a study published by the American Society of Clinical Oncology, collecting data on sexual orientation, gender identity, and variations in sex characteristics has allowed patients to feel more welcomed and has reduced disparities in health treatments and other forms of care. So again, I say this has been requested by the community, by the scientists, and as I said earlier, what is so threatening about collecting data? It's just information. It's not a policy change, it's collecting data.
So Madam Chair, the Census Bureau is asking your committee to do this? Because
The human rights.
Okay,
the
but
human-
not the Census Bureau. They have not requested this.
No, they
Mr.
have not
Palmer?
requested it. They
Okay,
have
just-
not.
Okay, just to be clear, the Census Bureau itself has not requested this.
Yeah,
Mr.
and it would
Palmer?
not be in the census, it would be in the American Survey, which is another survey that they do, which is not the decennial
Right.
census.
But they already have the ability to ask these questions anyhow. Ranking Member Comer?
And I think that's an important component of this bill, why it's not needed and we shouldn't support this bill, because we haven't heard from the Census Director, we haven't heard from the directors of the various lead agencies that will be conducting these surveys. And the Oversight Committee has jurisdiction over the census and over these surveys, but yet we haven't had anyone come before the committee. We had the Census Director come before the committee many, many times last year to give us updates, and really for the past 2 years. But we've not heard from anyone on this bill. So again, I urge opposition.
I would say that President Biden included his request in his budget to do this. And as I put into the record, there are 200 organizations requesting this, 200 organizations that have requested this. And as I said, the Human Rights Campaign Fund, which is the organization that is the advocacy group for the LGBTQ plus population, have requested it. And again, it's data collection.
Ranking Member Comer?
That's another good point Chairwoman mentioned. We didn't mention this in the markup, but I guess it was because it's in an appropriations bill, but I believe I read in the appropriations bill where the Biden administration is requesting $10 million. And if I'm wrong, I apologize. If you want to correct me, feel free. I just read this in the press. $10 million to study how the proper way to ask the question is, to word the question without being offensive. $10 million. So this comes at a cost. It's not in this bill, but it's in the budget. They want to spend 10 million taxpayer dollars to determine the best way to ask the question of gender identity and sexual orientation. I think that's a waste of it.
Point of information and correction, it's not just to ask a question, it's to implement the program and collect the data and give the necessary resources to the agencies and others that are collecting the data.
All right, Ranking Member Comer, you were talking about the markup. I know you've referenced before that my good friend Chip Roy had an amendment. You referenced another amendment. What amendments would have made this bill more palatable that were just not considered?
First of all, Representative Biggs had the amendment to ask the citizenship question. Then Representative Cloud had an amendment to clarify male and female, to add definitions for the terms male and female, because there's still a lot of unclarity with some of my Democrat colleagues on what actually is a male and female. So they didn't oppose that. Then Mr. Groffman had an amendment which would prohibit collection of this information from minor children. So all three of those amendments failed in committee on a party line vote.
Thanks, Mr. Comer. I appreciate it. Madam Chair, thanks for being here. I appreciate it. With that, I yield back.
Ms. Ross.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think this is a simple solution to a complicated problem. And this bill basically says, we see you. We see you. We hear your concerns. We want to represent you. And as Kathy Renna, of the National LGBTQ Task Force says, if we don't get counted, we don't count. This nation has gone through Don't Ask, Don't Tell, encouraging people to not be themselves. And we're at a place right now where we, as people who represent all people, we have a responsibility to say, if you want to be counted, we see you, we hear you, and we represent you. I support the bill, and I yield back.
Thank you. Does any other member, guys, Ms. Fishbach, I skipped you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Excuse me, I just swallowed my water at the wrong moment. You know, I guess I have just kind of a few questions, just some little bit of pondering as I'm listening to the discussion. But Madam Chair, one of the things you said is that President Biden put this in an executive order. So, and it's happening. So why are we spending time on the bill if that's the case?
Because executive orders are temporary. They can be thrown out, they can be removed, they can be halted immediately. They're not there. I want this to happen. I want to listen to the scientific community and to collect data on a whole segment of our society that is being not thought about in the first sense or the second sense, the third sense, or not thought about at all. It also is a community. I just know the statistics in New York because I represent it, but it may be the same across the country, that is targeted for violent crime. Why? Why should they be targeted for violent crime? We need to understand these issues. They have tremendous problems. When we were doing research on the COVID crisis and our response to it, they were completely left out. No one looked at them. No one talked about them. We talked about women. We talked about children.
My time. I'm sorry.
We talked about everything, but we didn't talk about the
Excuse
LGBT.
me.
So they're asking to be heard, they're asking to be researched, and they're asking to have some answers, that's all.
All right, but thank you.
Just information.
Yep, I understand. But I do have some other questions, and I did want to kind of associate myself with the question or the comment of Mr. Comer and of Mr. Reschenthaler, and they had these questions that can't be answered. They're the question of what do we do with the data? You know, there's the compelling question of there's no reason. What are we doing with these things? And those are questions that can't be answered. So I just wanted to make sure that those were the questions I had too.
Right.
And so I appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a question I have. That's a question Republicans had in committee. What is the government going to do with this information? And again, if it says on the survey, you don't have to answer this question truthfully, then how can you guarantee there's an accurate amount of data collected. It's just, it makes no sense, and again, it's not something that I think we need to be spending taxpayer dollars on and wasting precious congressional time debating.
And Ranking Member, that is one of the, when it's mentioned that we need all of this information, we need scientific information, it's not. It's not even accurate. This is not reliable information.
Right.
If it is voluntary, and it would be shameful for us to be basing spending or government programs on information that is not accurate, that's not reliable, because it's voluntary.
That's exactly right.
And so I just have real questions, serious questions about how this is being done, and I really question why anyone would want to give the government any additional information, and so how many people are actually going to participate in this. But I do want to just, Ranking Member, give you the opportunity if there's anything else you'd like to add before we close out.
No, I appreciate the opportunity. I just, again, don't think this is something the Oversight Committee should be focused on. I think that with all the crises at the southern border, with the spike in crime, with inflation out of control, with all the government giveaways that have happened in the last two administrations in the name of COVID, there's no shortage of oversight that needs to be conducted by the committee, and I wish that we would focus on providing oversight for the executive branch and oversight for the federal government, because that's our role. And this is, again, something that it's not going to be accurate data. It's voluntary. It's an intrusion. We don't know who's going to answer these questions for the children and what effect this is going to have on children. So I don't think this is a good bill, and I encourage opposition to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Mr. Neguse. Okay, I don't see him on. Does any other member of the committee wish to ask a question? Seeing none, I would like to thank our witnesses for their testimony. Please leave with our stenographer or submit electronically anything that you would like inserted into the record. You're now excused. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify. I always enjoy the artwork. It's really interesting. It's great to see all my friends here.
So now I would like to welcome our next panel to testify on amendments. Dr. Burgess and Representative Griffith from Virginia. So I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Dr. Burgess.
Thank you. This is an amendment, amendment number 2, to H.R. 5585, the ARPA-H bill. This amendment prohibits this bill from being interpreted by any federal agency in a way that will impede or interfere with the innovation, development, distribution of transformative health technologies, including diagnostic tests for early disease detection. If the goal indeed of ARPA-H is to encourage medical innovation, then American physicians should receive access to cures and treatments in a timely manner. Transformational research and development are difficult for any company to invest because of the health cost constraints. There is a healthcare company with an investigational blood test that has the ability to detect 50 different types of cancers before a patient becomes symptomatic. The test has been granted breakthrough device designation from the FDA. To put it simply, this test is revolutionary. This amendment will ensure that no government entity can deter the development of transformational research treatments or new technologies. So I would urge that this amendment be made in order. It's an important amendment, and indeed it will be transformational in medicine. I yield back.
Thank you. Representative Griffith.
Yes, ma'am, I believe I'm on, yes. So mine is amendment number 47, 117-51. So if you go through and you compare all the pieces, what this bill does in part, and I support the underlying bill, what this bill does in part is it lifts the number of patients, the cap that we've had. We started off federally with a cap on buprenorphine of 30. Then in 2006, we went to 100 patients after a year. Then you could get a waiver and you could go on then to 275, which we passed in the Support Act. We went to 275 by regulation, and then we passed that 275 in the Support Act. My concern is the federal government has always had a limiting number on this. And so my original amendment said, all right, let's just eliminate that and put it back to where it was. One of my colleagues mentioned to me that why don't we let the states do it through their medical departments or through their legislatures. The problem with that is it'll take at least a year for most of the states to be able to take any action. So we're taking the cap completely off. Now, my concern is, is that I think there probably ought to be a cap of some form. I'm happy to let the states pick the number that's right for that individual state. And 275 seemed like a pretty big number. If you've seen Dope Sick, or more importantly, if you've read the book, because I haven't actually seen the series yet, I want to, but I haven't. But if you've read the book, 2/3 of the things that happen in that book happen in my district. There is the potential for abuse of buprenorphine and Suboxone, which is buprenorphine and naloxone, which makes it a little less addictive. But even with that, they have found that Suboxone, which is now you get a prescription, you can take it home, that is now being abused in some cases. Is it better than heroin or fentanyl? Yes, it is. I'm not arguing that. What I'm saying, though, is there's great potential for abuse. Not as great as heroin or fentanyl, but there is potential for abuse. And in fact, it has been detected or found to be being sold on the street. And so I think we need to be careful. So number one reason for passing this amendment or making it in order and giving us a chance to pass this amendment is that I believe that we need to have some limit, and if that's set by the states, fine, because I think that you could end up with a rogue physician or medical care person somewhere who decides this is a cash cow, they're under a lot of stress for whatever reasons, and the next thing you know, I have abuse there. The second reason is, even if you're not using it as a cash cow and you're not under financial stress and there's always rogue actors in every profession, and I love my doctors, and it was actually the doctors, we were sitting around one day talking about the bill, and a couple of doctors raised the issue. And that's when my antenna went up. The other issue is that if you're using Suboxone to try to treat people for an opioid use disorder, the concept is that you've got people monitoring them, you've got healthcare professionals, mental health care professionals as well as medical. So you've got medical and mental health care professionals helping these people. And if you're doing it right, it takes years. I think it's 1 month for every month that you're addicted necessary to come off of it. So it's not an easy fix no matter how you look at it. But you have to monitor these patients to see if they're doing what they're supposed to, and then slowly, and encourage them to slowly step down the level. If you're carrying too many patients, I just don't believe that any one individual healthcare provider can necessarily do that step down and provide the in-depth treatment that these folks need when you get above 275 patients. Now, maybe there's folks out there a whole lot better than I am, but I was a street lawyer for nearly 30 years, and whenever my caseload got to 300, I was in a panic because I couldn't keep track of everything that was happening with all my different clients. And so I just don't know how a medical professional individually could handle that more than 275. That being said, I'm happy to let the states regulate it. They may have better evidence. It may work differently in South Dakota than it works in rural Virginia. It may work differently in California than it works in New York. I don't know, and I'm happy to let the medical folks work on that at a state-by-state basis. But they need time to adapt to the fact that we're taking off the cap that we originally put on this fairly potent drug. Again, better than heroin, better than fentanyl. It's good to start weaning these people off. But the potential for abuse is so great that I think we need to do something. This gives the states the opportunity to pass their own rules, and they may do something different than what I think is appropriate. And just so you don't think I'm whistling to the wind. I've already mentioned it to one of my state legislators as potential legislation in Virginia for next year, because I do think that the states ought to be alert, and then they can make that decision. So that's what my amendment does. It's pretty simple. It's not an attempt to derail the bill. It's not an attempt to do any harm to the bill. I just want to make sure that we're not inadvertently creating unintended consequences that does harm to folks in our various districts. And I yield back. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Mr. Grothman?
Wow, this is great.
We are very efficient.
Nothing better than showing up in rules and not having to wait.
Turn on your mic, sir, please.
Okay. This is an amendment to HR 4173, which is the Lgbtqi, I think, plus Data Inclusion Act. The purpose of the bill is to take federal surveys and to require a question on sexual preference on the surveys. I think that is just a ridiculous bill for so many reasons. I think it's, poking around in people's private lives and whatnot. But, so I think the bill is not reformable. But my amendment removes children under age 18 with regard to this requirement. The proponents of the bill would say it's not required, but nevertheless, for the purpose of the census or many other federal surveys, some of which the National Survey of Children's Health eventually brings all children under the survey every 2 years, it means somebody is going to have to guess or fill out a form in which it says, sexual orientation or gender identity or what have you. The idea that a teacher, a guidance counselor, or a parent, or the child himself or herself would have to disclose sexual orientation, and it's apparent from the discussion in committee that can be a 11 or 10 or 8-year-old or something, is ridiculous. I think you're over-sexualizing the young people. If you're a teacher who's got to fill out this form, what do? You ask little Johnny, are you gay? Are you transgender? Are you whatever? It's just, I think, offensive beyond belief, and I don't think under any circumstances you have any business collecting sexual orientation data on somebody age 18. And of course, the way things are going now, they may even say, we expect you to declare what you are when you're 8 or when you're 9 or something. So it's just offensive. Offensive beyond belief. So we would ask in the bill that if we must collect data by sexual orientation, we not collect it for children.
You're done?
Is that okay?
You yield back?
You sound like, you look like you're giving me a favorable response.
Absolutely not.
She's just being friendly.
But I do thank you for your testimony. Did you
Okay.
yield back?
Sure.
Okay, thank you. So now I will turn to Mr. Cole for any questions that you may have. Okay. Mr. Perlmutter? No? Dr. Burgess?
Yeah, I'm having difficulty deciding which is the best of these amendments. So I think they are all so well constructed that they all should be made in order, and members ought to be given the opportunity to vote for or against the amendments. Mr. Griffith, thank you for bringing the issues to the Rules Committee. You're absolutely correct. These are incredibly complex patients that require a lot of time and expertise, and just simply opening the top limit may not solve our problems and may create a host of new ones that have not been anticipated. So I thank you for bringing that up. And I'll yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Roskin, welcome to the committee. Did you have a question or
Thank you. No
comments?
further questions. No.
Okay. Ms. Fishbach? Well, did I skip over it? I am so sorry.
It's okay. I'll yield back. I don't have any
Okay.
questions anyhow.
I thought you were going like this, but okay. Ms. Fishbach, did you have a question? No. Ms. Scanlon? Does anyone on the majority side have a question? And seeing none, does anyone else in the committee have any questions? No. Okay. Thank you for coming to our committee.
It's enjoyable. I haven't seen you guys for a while.
You're excused. Please leave anything that you brought in writing that you wish to submit to leave it with our stenographer. And if not, you're excused.
Thank you.
Are there any other members who wish to testify on H.R. 4176, H.R. 7666, or H.R. 5585? Seeing none, this closes the hearing on H.R. 4176, H.R. 7666, and H.R. 5585. So before we move on to our markup, I want to recognize a longtime rules staffer who will be leaving us next week to head to the Department of Commerce as Director of Legislative Affairs. Rose Laughlin has been with the Rules Committee for an impressive 8 years, starting as an intern with the late Chairwoman Louise Slaughter, who is looking down on us now with great pride for all of Rose's accomplishments. Rose was Ms. Slaughter's right-hand woman, and I know that they developed a close bond. And I'm sure she is, as I am, very proud of all that you have accomplished, Rose, and not only advancing to a senior professional staff member here at the Rules Committee, and now moving on to your next adventure. We will miss your expertise gained from years of working on the unique issues that are thrown at the Rules Committee, especially environment and gun violence prevention issues, which you have become an expert on, and your fun, positive, and collaborative attitude toward everyone on the team on both sides of the aisle. Rose, you will always have a home in this Capitol, and certainly in the Rules Committee. We're going to miss you, but we are excited to continue working with you in your new role. And I think for all the members of this committee who may have issues with the administration on various related to the Commerce Department, we now know who to call. So Dr. Burgess will have you in speed dial. But we are very proud of you, Rose, and seriously, we're thrilled at the new opportunity, but we're going to miss you a lot. So thank you so much for everything. All right, and now, at this time, the chair will entertain a motion from the distinguished gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Ross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move the committee report a structured rule for consideration of H.R. 4176, the LGBTQI+ Data Inclusion Act. The rule provides for 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Oversight and Reform or their designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 117-52 modified by the amendment printed in Part A of the Rules Committee report shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule makes in order only those further amendments to H.R. 4176 printed in Part B of the Rules Committee report. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by the member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and the opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in Part B of the report. The rule provides one motion to recommit. The rule further provides for consideration of H.R. 5585, the Advanced Research Projects Agency Health Act, under a structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate on the bill, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking members of the Committee on Energy and Commerce or their designee. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Energy and Commerce, now printed in the bill, shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule makes in order the further amendments to H.R. 5585 printed in Part C of the Rules Committee report. If offered by the member designated in the report, which shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for a time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and the opponent, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendment printed in Part C of the Rules Committee report. The rule provides one motion to recommit. The rule further provides for consideration of H.R. 7666, the Restoring Hope for Mental Health and Well-Being Act of 2022, under its structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate on the bill, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce or their designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that an amendment in the nature of a substitute, consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 117-51, modified by the amendment printed in Part D of the Rules Committee report, shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule provides that following debate, each further amendment printed in Part E of the Rules Committee report, not earlier considered as part of the amendments en bloc pursuant to Section 6, shall be considered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, and shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and opponent, may be withdrawn by the proponent at any time before the question is put thereon, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. Section 6 of the rule provides that at any time after the debate, the chair of the Committee on Energy and Commerce or his designee may offer amendments en bloc consisting of further amendments printed in Part E of the Rules Committee report not earlier disposed of. Amendments en bloc shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for 20 minutes, equally divided and controlled by the chair and the ranking minority member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce or their designees, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in Part E of the report and amendments en bloc described in Section 6 of the resolution. The rule provides one motion to recommit. The rule provides that House Resolution 188 is amended by striking June 22nd, 2022, each place it appears, and inserting July 13th, 2022. Finally, the rule provides that the proceedings may be postponed through July 15th, 2022 on measures that were the object of motions to suspend the rules on the legislative days of June 21st through June 24th, 2022, and on which the yeas and nays were ordered.
You heard the motion for the gentleman from North Carolina. Any amendments or discussion? Mr. Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee add language to the rule that would eliminate the ability to vote remotely by proxy. Mr. Chairman, I offer this motion again in light of the latest reported abuse where a member of Congress used proxy voting because he was socializing in the south of France. I certainly don't begrudge any of my colleagues for that choice. We all have to make choices as members of Congress, especially when there are important life events for family and friends. And certainly, as I've said repeatedly, proxy voting has been used by members of both sides of the aisle, as a matter of convenience, not as a matter of health or safety. But this latest instance is just, once again, makes it crystal clear that proxy voting has long outlived its purpose, which I will remind my friend was for those members who could not safely travel to Washington at the height of the pandemic. Being a member of Congress is a great privilege and responsibility, and it forces members to make tough choices sometimes. But that's what we sign up for when we decide to run for office. Long overdue to repeal the use of proxy voting, and I urge the adoption of my motion and yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his amendment. I will oppose the amendment. Let me just say, as I said when we first did proxy voting, it is supposed to be used not as a convenience, but out of necessity. And we still have members who are getting COVID. Our chairwoman, Maxine Waters, was last week, so this is still a real issue. We're not the police up here, so we don't keep track of Democrats or Republicans who may misuse it. But clearly, we all know about when people misuse it based on press accounts. So the press, people are going to have to explain themselves. But you know, I do think that just because if you get COVID, that you shouldn't have to not be able to represent your constituents. And so I still very much believe it's the right thing. I should also say, I guess as the author of this, you know, I mean, I guess, you know, I've never gotten COVID to the best of my knowledge. I get tested regularly, but I've never used it. I've missed votes because that's the spirit in which it's supposed to, in which I viewed the changes to be made. So in any event, I would urge a no vote. Anybody else have anything to say on this? If not, the vote is on the Cole Amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have
That
it.
a request a recorded vote?
Recorded vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres.
No.
Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin. Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon. Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli. Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. DeSaulnier.
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Ms. Ross.
No.
Ms. Ross, no. Mr. Neguse.
No.
Mr. Neguse, no. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Rushenthaler. Mr. Rushenthaler, aye. Mrs. Fishbach. Aye. Mrs. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
Notice I read further amendments. Dr. Burgess.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make an order, amendment number 2, to H.R. 5585, offered by myself. This amendment prohibits the bill from being interpreted in a way that will impede or interfere with the innovation, development, or distribution of transformative health technologies, including diagnostic tests for early disease detection. This is important because there is breakthrough technology that is now available, but unfortunately, the Federal Trade Commission is holding it up because the Federal Trade Commission says that there's only one company doing it, it must be a monopoly, and they can't be allowed to do that. ARPA-H is only going to succeed if we take off some of the shackles. This amendment would prohibit the assignment of the innovation, the interference with the transformative health technologies, including diagnostic tests for early disease detection, which, as I outlined in my early argument, really will fundamentally change medicine. So I urge adoption or allowing this amendment to be heard and allowing members to vote their will on it.
You heard the, for the gentleman?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Could I have the gentleman repeat that? I'm kidding. I was just kidding.
Anybody else have anything to say about the Burgess Amendment? If not, the vote is on the Burgess Amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Recorded vote has been requested.
Mrs. Torres.
No.
Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin. Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon. Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli. Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. DeSaulnier.
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Ms. Ross. No. Ms. Ross, no. Mr. Neguse.
No.
Mr. Neguse, no. Mr. Cole. Aye. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Rushenthaler. Aye. Mr. Rushenthaler, aye. Mrs. Fishbach. Aye. Mrs. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk, report the total.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
Matters not agreed to. Further amendments? Hearing none, the vote is on the motion from the gentleman from North Carolina. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Recorded vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Raskin. Mr. Raskin, aye. Ms. Scanlon. Ms. Scanlon, aye. Mr. Morelli. Mr. Morelli, aye. Mr. DeSaulnier.
Aye.
Mr. DeSaulnier, aye. Ms. Ross. Aye. Ms. Ross, aye. Mr. Neguse.
Aye.
Mr. Neguse, aye. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Rushenthaler. Mr. Rushenthaler, no. Mrs. Fishbach. No. Mrs. Fishbach, no. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk, report the total.
9 yeas, 4 nays.
And the motion is agreed to. Accordingly, Ms. Ross will carry it for the majority.
Mr. Burgess, health permitting, will carry it tomorrow. Well, you're the doctor. You make the call.
And so without objection, the committee is adjourned.